Chapter 5, Colonial Society on the Eve of Revolution, 1700 to 1775. Let's get started. All right, 2 key points for this chapter. I just want to say right now that this chapter 5 is sort of like a transitional chapter. In chapter 6, if you did look ahead, we're looking at sort of the early conflict that existed in North America with the French and Indian War, and then kind of the fallout after that, which is definitely, obviously, a precursor to the American Revolution. So this chapter really is a nice chance to look at, remind ourselves of the regional differences that existed, obviously, but also look at this early colonial unity. And this chapter really focuses on sort of the unique North American British colonial identity that had emerged by the mid-1700s. So whether it's work and lifestyle or architecture or economic systems that were uniquely American, obviously we have a strong religious presence before the Great Awakening with this sort of purifying attempt in New England at least, but certainly after the 1730s, 1740s, we have a very democratized and diverse religious experience in the colonies. We have a social structure that's unique to the area. We have a sort of melting pot, as a reference in this chapter, in terms of demographics. And we have political autonomy in the colonies that will certainly lead to a desire to retain or maintain that after the French and Indian War and the crackdown by the British Empire. So while natural population growth was slow in Virginia in the 1600s, by the 1700s this changes, and we see a dramatic increase in the colonial population. And by 1800, as you can see, there are more people in the colonies than there were in Great Britain. In 1775, here are your most populous colonies. As you can see, Virginia being the largest, followed by Massachusetts, the 2 very important colonies for our study moving forward. And the vast majority, 90% of people, lived in rural areas and were likely to be involved in rural activity. Keep in mind that Thomas Jefferson did have this sort of ideal version of what a republic would be, and it was an agrarian republic in his mind. As I said before, there is a melting pot of sorts in the early British colony experience here. By 1775, at least, we see that there are Germans that are 6% of the population and Scotch-Irish at 7%. Germans were often settling in Pennsylvania. We know that. I'm going to show you a map in a second here. The Scotch-Irish were often thought of in a pretty negative way. They certainly were involved in this armed march of the Paxton Boys on Philadelphia in 1764, which is a protest towards his lenient policy with the natives. They also were involved with this regulator movement that occurred in Carolina a few years after that. About 5% of the colonial population was other European groups, including French Huguenots, the Welsh, the Dutch, Swedes, Jews, Irish, Swiss, and Scots Highlanders. So when they say the Irish here, they mean Irish Catholics, and obviously the Scots Highlanders as opposed to the Scots Lowlanders, who we often call the Scotch Irish. Take a look at the map here. You can see, though, sort of where people were settling. A lot of German immigrants to the Philadelphia region, as you can see there. Scotch-Irish also sort of on the frontier of that region of Pennsylvania as well. Notice that New England, there was not a lot of diversity in New England, and we did talk about that last chapter, and part of that had to do with the fact that there wasn't really suitable land for large-scale farming, so these immigrants looked elsewhere. In terms of the structure of colonial society, we see by the 1700s in Boston and Philadelphia, the richest 10% of the population in those 2 cities owned 2/3 of the taxable wealth. Remember that in the South, we have that planter class, right? The wealthy planters who basically retained social, economic, and political power for quite some time. So again, it's an uneven distribution of wealth. By 1750, Boston contained a large number of homeless poor that were forced to wear the letter P on their clothing. And the influx of indentured servants will add to the population of the lower classes, many of which find themselves on the frontier. So again, we have sort of a conflict of interest or opposing interest with this poorer class of Americans in the West and the more established, wealthier class in the East. African slaves are obviously on the bottom rung of that social ladder. So I have 2 visuals here, and obviously these are not apples to apples, but again, if you look at the left-hand chart here, you can see that we'll use 1775 in Boston as an example. 61% of the wealth is contained by the richest 10% of the population. Philadelphia, you see 69% there. Obviously not exact to the numbers that we used in the last slide, but very close. On the right-hand side, you see a more modern representation of this. And while this is in trillions of dollars as opposed to percentage of wealth, you can see that the top 10% control a majority of wealth. And so this uneven distribution of wealth is something we'll be talking about basically for the whole year. Let's take a look at some positions in society, including the Christian ministry, which was considered a very prestigious position to hold, as opposed to two positions that in the modern world are considered very prestigious, physicians and lawyers. Physicians in colonial America were poorly trained. As you can see, the first medical school didn't even open until 1765, so that's 160 years or so after we see English settlements actually planted in the New World. Epidemics were common, and the treatment for those were pretty crude, including bleeding of the sick to try to cure them, as well as administering things such as powdered dried toad for smallpox. Lawyers were not particularly looked at very well. This is John Adams on the bottom right-hand side. It said in the text that when he was actually courting his future wife, her father didn't like him simply because he was a lawyer. In English North America, farming is the leading industry, and that includes large-scale cash crops like tobacco and sugar, but also the small-scale farmer, the yeoman farmer who's farming for sustenance to grow food for his family, plus a little bit extra to trade. Other major industries were fishing. I think the text said in chapter 1 that there was more money made from cod fishing than all of the Spanish gold, or the Aztec gold that was taken by the Spanish combined. Trade was also going to be a very popular industry especially New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. And we'll look at the triangular trade route in a second here. Shipbuilding would be the only real industry, manufacturing, I should say, in the colonies. We have an abundant supply of timber, obviously, and so that's great for shipbuilding. And as you can see, by 1770, roughly 1/3 of the British merchant marine was actually built in the colonies. And here is that triangular trade route. You can see sort of finished goods coming from England and Europe to North America, and also some to Africa. From Africa, of course, we would see slaves and gold being brought. From New England, it's more of the raw materials, but also rum. That was distilled sugar from the West Indies, obviously, brought to Africa in the trade of slaves. Keeping with this idea of work and the economy, the colonies begin to outproduce demand. So we have a little bit of an imbalance here by the 1730s. This is, we'll say 30 years or so before we see real conflict between the colonies and Great Britain. There's high demand for British goods, but the market is flooded of American exports in Britain. And so the colonies begin to look for other ways to offload their wares. And so smuggling to other European countries, mainly the French, I think, will become pretty common. And this is going to be an issue for the British as it sort of opposes, right, this whole principle of mercantilism. Again, mercantilism is an economic concept where colonies are created for the enrichment of the parent state. So if those colonies are now actually profiting for themselves more so than they are contributing to the parent state, then you have a bit of an issue. 1773, after some pressure from the British West Indies, Parliament passed the Molasses Act, which was designed to crush North American trade with the French West Indies, again trying to attack smuggling. When we're talking about the economy, it's important to look at infrastructure as well. And while we did reference the idea of shipbuilding and the use of ships in trade in the previous slide, we should also acknowledge that there were crude roadways in the colonies. They were really bad in terms of the quality, especially in the West. And again, we start to see, distinct Western concerns and issues, frontier issues that really oppose or challenge sort of the lifestyle of the East. And this idea of the roads is a good example. By the mid-1700s, we do see an intercolonial postal system established. And so again, sort of moving towards this more unified and more modern lifestyle. By 1775, there were two tax-supported established churches, the Anglican Church and the Congregational Church. Now, the Anglican, or Church of England, was more focused in the South, and we did mention already that William and Mary was founded in 1693 to train a better class of clerics for the Anglican Church. The more rigid of the original established churches would be the Congregational Church, and this is what emerged out of the Puritan Church in New England, and it was established officially in all New England colonies except for Rhode Island. There were other denominations that existed everywhere, but in New England, especially here, you can see, including the Presbyterian Church, but it was not an official church in any of the colonies. In general, religious toleration did make tremendous strides, as you can see, and people could worship or not worship as they pleased, at least by 1775. Now, a lot of that toleration comes from this Great Awakening. 1730s, 1740s, there's a huge religious revival in the colonies. It is a significant challenge to the established authority, and it really takes a lot of power away from the clergy, and it starts to focus on sort of individual experiences, an individual study of the Bible and of religion in general. It's also a shared experience for the colonists, as in it transcends colonial boundaries, as itinerant preachers, for example, do travel around spreading their message. So people in different colonies could and would know these big name celebrity style preachers and would have heard their sermons. So again, it's sort of the beginning of a common shared experience. It also democratized religion, and it led to the creation of new religious sects. Okay, so a huge challenge to the Calvinist doctrine of predestination is something called Arminianism, and it's named after Jacobus Arminius, a Dutch theologian, who preached that individual free will, not divine decree, would determine a person's eternal fate. Now, the Great Awakening is going to be said to start in Northampton, Massachusetts, under the leadership of Jonathan Edwards. And he, by the way, is described in the text as being one of the greatest minds ever to come from the colonies. He said that faith in God, rather than doing good works, could lead to one attaining eternal salvation. Now, an example of transatlantic movement would be this English preacher, George Whitefield, who gave America a different kind of enthusiastic type of preaching. And he is actually said to be an incredibly skilled speaker. He can address these huge crowds. This is Jonathan Edwards, by the way, on the left, and here is George Whitefield on the right. But because of the skill of his speaking ability, he was able to just move people to tears. And so this real emotional experience came to be a part of this sort of new light, great awakening sermon. And here's an image of that actually happening. Whitefield, look, he's on top of a box or a tree stump. I can't quite see. He's outdoors. He's not inside a church. There appears to be a beer in this picture as well. But people, you can see, are very much emotionally attached to this sermon. And again, so it's very different from the sort of traditional religious, rigid religious experience in these Puritan churches of the 1600s. Now, I kind of referenced this quickly in the last slide, but there are the old lights and the new lights, right? The old lights are the orthodox, traditional clergymen who saw the Great Awakening in a very negative way, that it was changing the established church, that it was challenging authority and therefore sort of weakening religion. Whereas the new lights looked at the Great Awakening and said, hey, it may be doing that, you may be right, but what it's definitely doing is it's bringing people back to the church. It's bringing religion back to prominence in colonial life. And while it did emphasize a direct emotional spirituality and therefore undermined sort of the structure of the clergy and their authority, it started new churches and denominations. It got people back into religion, and as I said, it sort of just revitalized faith in general. You can see here that the Anglican Church was very concentrated from sort of, we'll say, New Jersey and southern Pennsylvania down, whereas a Congregational Church is more of a New England phenomenon. Just want to share this slide with you, which I borrowed from somebody else, actually. The early colleges of Harvard and William & Mary, we mentioned them. Yale in 1701 is a Congregational university. In fact, it actually was first created in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, just next door to where I teach. And then it moved to New Haven, obviously. But there were several colleges that were created as a result of the Great Awakening, and they reflect this sort of democratization and creation of new sects. So you can see Princeton, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth, all a product of that. The text did say that Puritan New England was more interested in education than any other section. I can tell you, I won't say that New England today appreciates education more than other sections of the United States, but I'll say with confidence that education is still prized in New England. But then it certainly stressed the need for the ability to read the Bible, for individuals to worship God in their own way, in their own private home, and schools were often focused on training men for the ministry. All right, take a look at this house. You'll see it's quite symmetrical. This is an example of the Georgian style architecture, which was common in the colonies. We also see science in the colonies. We've talked quite a bit about religion, but here with Ben Franklin, who was considered to be the only first-ranked scientist in the New World, we do see sort of progress of a different type. Speaking of progress, here in 1734 and 35, we have a court case which is going to set precedent for freedom of the press. So please make sure you highlight or star this. John Peter Zenger was charged with printing a negative article about the corrupt royal governor of New York, and here is an image depicting that trial right now. But the jury voted him not guilty because they said what he wrote was true. So you can write things in the paper that are true, even if they are negative and about public figures. Again, this is going to surprise pretty much everyone involved, but also lead to this concept of freedom of the press. So star that. Okay, 1775, let's look at the status of the colonies. There are 8 royal colonies by 1775, which means they're under the direct control of the king. The king will choose the governor. There are 3 proprietary colonies. In those colonies, the proprietor, such as William Penn, acts sort of as the king in the sense that he chooses the governors. There were 2 colonies, Connecticut and Rhode Island, that were still charter colonies and therefore elected their own governors under their self-governing charters. Nearly all of these colonies had a bicameral legislative body, a 2-house body, in which the upper house was appointed by the crown or the proprietor, if that were the case. The lower house, as it was the popular branch, will be elected by the people. So again, example of political autonomy to varying degrees, obviously, but is sort of the power to rule yourself in your own way is certainly a colonial experience. Here's a map that's very difficult to read. I know it's quite blurry, but you can see the green colonies are the royal colonies, and the purple colonies are the charter colonies of Connecticut, Rhode Island. And you see Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware being proprietary in nature. And speaking of maps, take a look at this one here, because in Chapter 6 we're going to look at these British colonies now coming into contact and conflict with their French neighbors in the Ohio River Valley. That's it for Chapter 5. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you soon. Take care.